Early references to a wall of separation, prefiguring the Jeffersonian metaphor. I'm reading from the book Thomas Jefferson and the Wall of Separation Between Church and State by Daniel L. Dreisbach. Just want to read briefly from some chapters. It says, there are those who hold that bishops may not meddle with the affairs of the Commonwealth because they are governors of another corporation, which is the church, nor kings with making laws for the church, because they have government not of this corporation but of another divided from it. The Commonwealth and the walls of separation between the two must forever be upheld. That's Richard Hooker in circa 1590s. The faithful laborers of many witnesses of Jesus Christ extant to the world, abundantly proving that when they have opened a gap in the hedge or wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, God have ever broke down the wall itself, removed the candlestick, and made his garden a wilderness as at this day. Roger Williams, 1644. Build an impenetrable wall of separation between things sacred and civil. James Bird, 1767. Although Thomas Jefferson is often credited with coining the wall of separation metaphor, he was not the first to use it in a church-state context. The image of a wall or similar barrier separating the realms of the church and the civil government can be found in Western political and theological literature centuries before Jefferson penned the Danbury Baptist Letter. The separation between ecclesiastical and civil authorities was, for example, a familiar theme in both the Renaissance and the Reformation eras. Separationist rhetoric was used by numerous writers to advance diverse arguments and to serve a variety of theological and political purposes. This rhetoric made occasional reference to a wall of separation, a structure of unambiguous demarcation that would differentiate between the sacred and the temporal, between ecclesiastical and civil institutions and or jurisdictions. A wall, for some theorists, was a symbol of protection and freedom. For others, it was a restrictive structure that imposed undue restraints on the proper roles of both church and state in civil society. Some thought a wall of separation shielded individual conscience from the rough and corrupting hands of civil and clerical authorities. Religious dissenters, in particular, hoped that placement of a wall between church and state would ensure a measure of autonomy from religious establishments in the exercise of religion. There were those who believed that a wall safeguarded the purity of religious truth and Christ's church from a fallen world. Still others thought that it protected the civil state from ecclesiastical interference or domination. Separationist themes emerged from the Renaissance and later from the Reformation. The language of separation is found in the writings of theological reformers. John Witt, Jr. observed that, quote, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Thomas Cranmer, Menno Simmons, and other 16th century reformers all began their movements with a call for freedom from this ecclesiastical regime, freedom of the individual conscience from the intrusive canon laws and clerical controls, freedom of political officials from ecclesiastical power and privileges, freedom of the local clergy from central papal rule and oppressive princely controls, end quote. Early in his Reformation ministry, Martin Luther, 1483 through 1546, wrote of a paper wall between the spiritual estate and the temporal estate. In his Institutes of the Christian Religion, John Calvin, 1509 through 1564, asserted that the spiritual kingdom and the political kingdom must always be considered separately because there is a great difference and unlikeness between ecclesiastical and civil power, and it would be unwise to mingle these two, which have a completely different nature. The Anabaptists, who believed they were in the world but not of the world, emphatically rejected the close identification of state and church that had been prevalent in Western Christendom since the reign of Constantine. They believed that the secular kingdom should be separated from the Church of Christ. No true Christian, they maintain, should exercise the sword of temporal authority, and no civil magistrate should exercise jurisdiction in spiritual matters because this is under the authority of God alone. Although the civil state was instituted and ordained by God and is necessary in the world, that is, among those who do not heed or obey Christ's teachings, it is not necessary among the true disciples of Christ. Menno Simmons, 1496 through 1564. A leader of the nonviolent king of the Dutch Anabaptists spoke of a Scheidingsmuur, a separating wall, or a wall of separation, between the realms of the true church and the fallen world. In a December 1548 epistle, Mendel Simmons wrote, and he says, "You see, our people have always insisted that the church, Gemeente, must be entirely outside Ruiten, the world. We must have a Shinding Smaru between us." Unquote. Jefferson clearly was not the first to use the wall of separation metaphor in discourse on the relationship between religion and civil government. Although one cannot be sure he was familiar with early references to the figure of speech. Indeed, in some cases he could not have known of the metaphor's use. There is little doubt that he knew of at least two works that made use of Masonic metaphor long before he wrote to the Connecticut Baptists. This chapter profiles three references to a wall of separation that predate the Danbury letter. Attention is focused on references to a wall of separation by Richard Hooker and the 16th century Anglican apologist Roger Williams, the 17th century colonial champion of religious liberty and the founder of Rhode Island, and James Byrd, an 18th century British political writer popular in revolutionary America. Each of these writers have lived in different ages, and each used the metaphor for purposes different from those of the others and from Jefferson's. It just goes on to talk about Richard Hooker's The Walls of Separation Between Church and the Commonwealth. This is chapter 6. Chapter 5. It talks about Roger Williams, The Hedge or Wall of Separation. James Byrd, An Impenetrable Wall of Separation. I want to read a little bit more from chapter 6 on creating effectual barriers, alternative metaphors in defense of religious liberty. If I could now conceive that the general government might ever be so administered as to render the liberty of conscience insecure, I beg you will be persuaded that no one would be more zealous than myself to establish effectual barriers against the horrors of spiritual tyranny and every species of religious persecution. George Washington to the United Baptist Churches of Virginia in 1789. I must admit, moreover, that it may not be easy in every possible case to trace the line of separation between the rights of religion and civil authority with such distinctness as to avoid collisions and doubts on essential points. James Madison to Jasper Adams, 1833. So Jefferson was not alone among his American contemporaries in championing metaphoric barriers for protecting civil and religious liberties. Indeed, the late 18th and 19th centuries literature is replete with various figurative barriers erected to safeguard civil liberty in general and religious liberty in particular. Some of these barriers were constructed before the Danbury letter, and some after. Most, if not all, pre-20th century alternatives to the wall were made without reference to or even knowledge of Jefferson's now famous construction. In more recent times, various commentators have proposed alternatives to or refinements of Jefferson's figurative language. This chapter surveys some of the notable barriers built in defense of civil and religious liberties. It's talking about effectual barriers. In the days following his inauguration, President George Washington received a flood of congratulatory addresses from diverse sources, including some 24 religious societies and congregations. These messages, in the words of the Virginian Baptist Association, were shouts of congratulations and praise for Washington's services in war and peace, and for his elevation to the chief magistracy of the United States. In May 1789, Washington replied to one such address from the United Baptist Churches in Virginia. In his letter, written only months before Congress drafted the First Amendment, the President praised the Baptists throughout America for being, says, quote, uniformly and almost unanimously the firm friends to civil liberty and the preserving promoters of our glorious revolution, end quote. He affirmed the, quote, sentiment that every man conducting himself as a good citizen ought to be protected in worshiping the deity according to the dictates of his own conscience, end quote. Addressing Baptists' fears that religious liberty was inadequately safeguarded under the new federal constitution, he also wrote that if the Constitution, says, quote, might possibly endanger the religious rights of any ecclesiastical society, or if the federal, says, government might ever be so administered as to render the liberty of conscience insecure, end quote, it says, then he would labor zealously to establish effectual barriers against the horrors of spiritual tyranny and every species of religious persecution. Commentators have observed that this graphic imagery prefigured Jefferson's First Amendment, wall of separation between church and state. Conrad Henry Moltmann, for example, remarked that, and he says, Washington's phrase, effectual barriers against the horrors of spiritual tyranny, was the forerunner of Jefferson's wall of separation between church and state. Both love figures of speech. Washington, the military man, thought of barriers. Jefferson, the man of home life, thought of a substantial, separating, secure wall around his estate. A barrier is the equivalent of a wall, especially when it is effectual. Noting that both Washington and Jefferson crafted barrier metaphors in their responses to Baptist associations, one Washington scholar remarked that Baptists, quote, look upon Washington's trope as the forerunner of Jefferson's wall of separation between church and state, end quote. Although Washington's imagery at least superficially resembles Jefferson's better-known metaphor, Washington's conceit differs from Jefferson in one vital respect. Washington was writing to the minority Baptist community in Virginia, which had grave reservations about the 1787 Constitution crafted in Philadelphia because they feared that it provided insufficient security for liberty of conscience and religious freedom. Washington did not suggest that effectual barriers are normally desirable, nor did he argue that a barrier between religion or religious rights and the civil state is a necessary precondition for religious liberty. Rather, he used the subjunctive mood to express a condition that he did not believe had existed. So, quote, if I could have entertained the slightest apprehension that the Constitution framed in the Convention might possibly endanger the religious rights of any ecclesiastical society, end quote, the President wrote then, says, certainly I would never have placed my signature to it, and if I could now conceive that the general or federal government might ever be so administered as to render the liberty of conscience insecure, I beg you will be persuaded that no one would be more zealous than myself to establish effectual barriers against the horrors of spiritual tyranny and every species of religious persecution. For you doubtless remember that I have often expressed my sentiment that every man conducting himself as a good citizen and being accountable to God alone for his religious opinions ought to be protected in worshiping the deity according to the dictates of its own conscience. Again, Washington did not make a normative case for a wall of separation. He did not advocate the erection of a constitutional barrier between church and state. Rather, he expressed a willingness to establish effectual barriers to separate people of faith from religious persecution and spiritual tyranny if warranted by circumstances. In this chapter, goes on to talk about effectual barriers. James Madison goes on to talk about certain fences, then a line of separation, the metaphor of a line of separation from proponents of James Madison's. This is all from creating effectual barriers. I wanted to continue to chapter 8, conclusion, the recreation of church-state law, policy and discourse, kind of like in the middle. This is mending wall or spike fence. The Supreme Court is keenly aware that its reliance on the wall of separation has been polarizing, acknowledging that the bitter controversy generated by separationist McCollum opinion, Justice Black observed, our instance on a wall between church and state, which must be kept high and impregnable, has seemed to some a correct exposition of the philosophy and a true interpretation of the language of the First Amendment, to which we should strictly adhere with equal conviction and sincerity. Others have thought the McCollum decision fundamentally wrong and have pledged continuous warfare against it. The wall has become the central icon of a strict separationist dogma that champions a secular polity in which religious influences are systematically stripped from public life. Therefore, strict separationists have ardently defended a conventional separationist construction of Jefferson's wall. With equal vigor, many religious traditionalists who have favored a public role for religion, who reject the secularization of law and policy, have protested the uncritical use of a metaphor not found in the Constitution, written by a man who was a member of neither the Constitutional Convention nor the First Federal Congress, to inform a secular separationist construction of American law and policy, that they contend that the wall misconceptualizes the original purpose of the First Amendment, religion guarantees. This section summarizes the competing claims of proponents and opponents of a wall of separation as a defining motive of American church-state law, policy, and discourse. It talks about good fences make good neighbors, the case for a wall. The wall proponents contend has profitably illumined our understanding of the constitutional arrangement for church-state relations. Defenders believe that the wall ably serves the previous noted functions of metaphor, making language dramatic and colorful, rendering abstract concepts concrete, and unleashing creative and analogical insights. And concretely and concisive communicates a complex constitutional principle. Moreover, the metaphor is simple and straightforward, which accounts for its remarkable appeal and utility. In Larkin versus Grindle's Den, 1982, Chief Justice Warren E. Burger cautiously praised Jefferson's idea of a wall. It says, a useful figurative illustration to emphasize the concept of separateness. The concept of a wall of separation is a useful signpost. Despite its detractors and despite its leaks and cracks and its archways, the constitutional historian Leonard W. Levy enthused says the wall ranks as one of the mightiest monuments of constitutional government in his nation, insofar as the First Amendment unequivocally prohibits not only the formal recognition of and legal preference for one particular church or denomination, but also all other forms of government assistance or encouragement for religious objectives, then the wall graphically conveys the essence of the First Amendment religion provision, given that a wall is concrete and immovable. The metaphor promises clarity and certainty to the division between civil and ecclesiastical authorities. Harold E. Fay, former editor of the Christian Century, championed the trope because, he says, the term wall, as Jefferson has used it, means a distinction, a limitation, a definition of fields of competence and authority. It clarifies rather than confuses thought, and it encourages rather than discourages dialogue between citizens. It is unlike a line of separation, which cannot always be easily discernible and can be ignored, overstepped. A wall unambiguously disrupts intercourse between church and state. Herein thought the doctrinaire separationist Justin Felix Frankfurter lay the virtue of a wall. Separation means separation, something less. Jefferson's metaphor is describing the relation between church and state, speaks of a wall of separation, not of a fine line easily overstepped. Perhaps most important, defenders of the wall believe that it promotes a sound, prudential policy of strict separation that is good for both the civil state and religion. Absolute separation is a policy worthy of aspiration, even if one conceives that it is impossible to implement strictly. As Justice Wiley B. Ridledge remarked in Everson, says, "We have staked the very existence of our country on the faith that complete separation between the state and religion is best for the state and best for the religion." So the court reiterated this theme the following term and explicitly connected it to the wall. And he said, "For the First Amendment rests upon the premise that both religion and government can best work to achieve their lofty aim if each is left free from the other within its respective sphere, or, as we said in the Everson case, the First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state, which must be kept high and impregnable." The wall is often described as a vital, indeed essential instrument for religious liberty. It says, "The central wisdom is sustaining the concept of the wall," Martin E. Franco wrote, "is that freedom of conscience is threatened when organized religion, or indeed organized irreligion, as in the former USSR, is brigaded and with government power. It makes no essential difference whether clerics or secular ministries seek to evade the principle of separation. Either way, the resulting alliance is neither holy nor salutary. Instead, it is deadening or ominous at best, and at worst it is nasty, banal, hypocritical, degrading, and dangerous to freedom." Dissenting in Board of Education versus Allen, 1968. The defiant Hugo L. Black opined, he says, "And I still believe that the only way to protect minority religious groups from majority groups in this country is to keep the wall of separation between church and state high and impregnable as the First and 14th Amendments provide. End quote. Black left no doubt that he believed that anything less than a strict separationist policy says generated discord, disharmony, hatred, and strife among our people. A commitment to church-state separation, proponents insist, does not necessarily signal indifference, much less hostility towards religion. Indeed, defenders of strict separation often argue the true religion flourishes when left to the voluntary support of adherents without assistance from or entanglements with civil government. Religious liberty cannot survive as long as civil government enforces belief in religious dogma or is entangled with ecclesiastical institutions. Therefore, a wall of separation is a useful construct for promoting the voluntary private support of religion and an environment in which freedom of religion can flourish, even if one concedes that the wall is an imperfect conceit. It is nonetheless an instructive figure of speech, a fingerpost pointing towards a prudent policy of strict church-state separation. Leading proponents are quick to defend the wall on historical grounds. It says, in the writings of Jefferson and others, Justice Wiley B. argued, says, it is to be found irrefutable confirmation of the First Amendment's sweeping content. Justice Hugo L. Black, whose Everson opinion revived judicial interest in Jefferson's wall, celebrated their leading roles played by Madison and Jefferson in promoting a regime of religious liberty and drafting and adoption of the First Amendment. The implication is clear. Great deference must be given to the considered views of Jefferson, including those expressed in the Danbury letter. The Reynolds court decades earlier described the missive almost as an authoritative declaration of the scope and effect of the First Amendment thus secured, because it had been penned by, and it said, an acknowledged letter of the advocates of the measure, the First Amendment. The wall, in summary, promotes private voluntary religion and freedom of conscience in a secular polity by preserving the independence of both religious institutions and the civil state from interference or domination by the other, by preventing religious establishments or even dangerous entanglements between governmental and ecclesiastical authorities, and by avoiding destructive sectarian conflicts among denominations competing for governmental favor and aid. An unyielding and well-maintained wall serves the interests of those on both sides. Defenders of the wall, such as Justice Frankfurter, are fond of quoting the ancient proverb made famous by Robert Frost. It says, good fences make good neighbors. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, the case against the wall. Critics of the wall argue that the graphic metaphor has been a source of much mischief because it reconceptualizes, indeed misconceptualizes, the First Amendment. In short, the metaphor, if taken too literally, mischaracterizes and distorts the constitutional principles that govern the relationship between religion and state and civil state. The First Amendment explicitly denies Congress the authority to make laws respecting an establishment of religion and granting legal preferences to one religious denomination over all others, whereas a wall of separation limits the activities of both the civil state and religion. Jefferson's trope uses the language of separation between church and state, unlike the First Amendment, which speaks in terms of non-establishment and free exercise of religion. The metaphor fails to distinguish between the concepts of separation and non-establishment. Critics fear that a wall separates religion from public life, and thereby promotes a religion that is strictly private and a state that is strictly secular. A high and impregnable wall inhibits religion's ability to inform the public ethic and policy, deprives religious citizens of the civil liberty to participate in politics armed with political opinions shaped by religious principles, and infringes the freedom of churches and religious institutions to define and extend their own mission and ministries, whether spiritual, social, or civic. A high wall also makes it difficult for civil government to provide services or to grant legal exemptions to accommodate the religious exercises of citizens and communities of faith. Detractors say that the metaphor's proponents have confused a trope for a legal principle, and indeed few dispute that the modern judiciary has elevated the wall of separation to a constitutional principle. To those who say the wall is a reason or a principle, Robert Hutchins retorted emphatically, it is not a reason, it is a figure of speech. A wall is often a structure of enmity that tends to set the two sides at odds with another as antagonists. Jefferson's court construction of a high impregnable wall barrier, unlike New England's low stone walls, Some critics argue and unavoidably invices a hostility towards the church and religion. This wall, they say, has been used to silence the religious voice in a marketplace of ideas and in a form of religious apartheid, to segregate faith communities behind a restrictive barrier. In any case, the wall privatizes religion by restricting religion to the private sphere, walling off religion from public life. The simplistic wall metaphor emphasizes separation over the free exercise of religion to the exclusion of the free exercise of religion. Some fear. Thus critics say, and they said, driving a wedge between the First Amendment, free exercise and establishment provisions, and creating the appearance of tension between them. An inflexible adherence to a high and impregnable wall can threaten not only free exercise rights but also other First Amendment rights, such as free speech and association of religious citizens in the public square. A high and impregnable barrier between church and state, critics contend, exceeds constitutional requirements. The First Amendment does not say that in every and all respects there shall be a separation of church and state, Justice William O. Douglas famously opined in Zorak versus Clausen in 1952. Moreover, as the Supreme Court has acknowledged, a perfect or absolute separation is impossible to sustain, even if it were the constitutional standard. Now, critics also argue that a wall of separation inadequately accommodates the nuance and the complexity of church-state relationships in modern society. The First Amendment, for example, may require the civil government in the interest of the free exercises of religion to grant religious citizens a privilege or exemption from legal requirements, for example, providing military chaplains for the armed forces or tax exemption for religious institutions. A high and impregnable wall of separation militates against such accommodation. Public policies premised on the existence of a wall of separation are incapable of acknowledging the nuisance of constitutional doctrine and even minor governmental accommodations of the peculiar needs of the religious community, provoke cries that the wall is being dismantled. This quote says, despite its simplicity, a critic argued, the wall of separation produces an inflexible all-or-nothing type of jurisprudence, which typically leaves out one side jumping for joy and the other side hopping mad. End quote. The First Amendment explicitly forbids the making of certain laws and does it a restriction on civil government only, and not a restraint on religion or the role of religion in public life. A wall of separation between church and state, however, restricts both the civil government and religion, inasmuch as a wall is a bilateral rather than a unilateral barrier that not only prevents civil government from invading the ecclesiastical domain as intended by the architects of the First Amendment, but also prohibits religion and the church from influencing the conduct of civil government. And the wall metaphor mischaracterizes the First Amendment. The various parallels guarantees in the First Amendment were entirely a check or restraint on civil government, specifically the national legislature. The free press guarantee, for example, was not written to protect the civil state from the press. Rather, it was designed to protect a free and independent press from control or interference by the federal government. Indeed, a free press was designed, in part, to serve as a check on or a watchdog over governmental powers. Similarly, the religion provisions were added to the Constitution to protect religion and religious institutions from rough or corrupting interference by the federal government, and not to protect the civil state from the influence of or overreaching by religion. Moreover, many founders believed religion and religious values liberated by the First Amendment free exercise guarantee would be like a free press, a check on government corruption and tyranny. In summary, the First Amendment prohibition on religious establishments was a clear restraint on the power of civil government, that is the federal government, to give legal preference to any single sect or combination of sects or to invade the religious domain. Any construction of Jefferson's wall then imposes restraints on entities other than civil government, critics say, exceeds the limitations imposed by the First Amendment, from which the wall metaphor was explicitly derived. Some critics have argued that the wall is a simplistic, jejune literary conceit that inadequately communicates, indeed denies the vitality of the First Amendment. In a dissenting opinion in the 1963 school prayer case, Justice Potter Stewart repudiated the court reliance on a sterile metaphor which by its very nature may distort rather than illumine the problems involved in a particular case. Stewart did not elaborate on why he found the wall a sterile metaphor. The eminent First Amendment scholar Alexander Meiklejohn similarly found the metaphor sterile and in its judicial application, complaining that the modern Supreme Court had stripped Jefferson's metaphor of its vital organic essence and had recast it in a mechanical barrier. And he says, the shift in the meaning of Jefferson's wall of separation is a striking illustration of the change from the organic to the mechanical interpretation of a figure of speech. As one reads the words of the rector of the University of Virginia, it is clear that the beliefs and attitudes of religion are, for him, separated from the other factors in education, in much the same way as is the bloodstream of a living body from its other structures and functions, that the bloodstream must be kept separate from the walls of the circulatory system. A break in them is disastrous, and yet the blood performs its living function only as it nourishes the whole body, giving health and vigor to all its activities. It is some such organic meaning as this which seeks expression in Jefferson's wall of separation, but men who claim to follow him have transformed his figure into one of mechanical division and exclusions. They speak of his wall as if it were made of brick and stone or steel. By so doing, they cut off our spiritual education from its proper field of influence. They make private a matter of supreme public importance, and the effect of that operation correspondingly closely to what would happen if we should substitute for the living tissues which enclose the cortex, or the nerves, or the blood castings of impenetrable steel. Reading from the wall, reading from What the Wall Separates, this chapter. Jefferson and Thanksgiving Day Proclamations. Jefferson said that he wanted to use his reply to Danbury Baptist to explain why he, as president, declined to issue religious proclamations. Although President Jefferson refused to designate a day for public fasting and thanksgiving and prayer, his general views on the propriety of such proclamations by civil magistrates are not entirely free of ambiguity. This refusal to issue religious proclamations despite some political costs is often portrayed as an example of his principled commitment to church-state separation. Jefferson's stance on religious proclamations merits further scrutiny. In his correspondence with Levi Lincoln, Jefferson said that the Danbury letter furnishes an occasion to which I have long wished to find of saying why I do not proclaim fastings and thanksgiving as my predecessors Washington and Adams did. Jefferson perhaps wanted to address this topic since religious proclamations had emerged as a sensitive political issue in the days leading to the election of 1800, when in March 1799 President John Adams recommended a national day of solemn humility, fasting, and prayer. His political adversaries depicted him as a tool of conservative religionists intent on establishing a national church. Just quote, a general suspicion prevailed, Adams recounted more than a decade later, says that the Presbyterian Church, which was presumed to be behind the proclamation, was ambitious and aimed at an establishment as a national church, end quote. Although this claiming any involvement in such a scheme, Adams ruefully reported that he, was represented as a Presbyterian, which he was not, and at the head of this political and ecclesiastical project. The secret whisper ran through all the sects. Let us have Jefferson, Madison, Burr, anybody, whether they be philosophers, deists, or even atheists, rather than a Presbyterian president. This reservoir of opposition to national fast and Thanksgiving, according to Adams, cost him the election in 1800. Jefferson was a political beneficiary, if not the instigator of this sentiment, and no doubt was eager to go on the record denouncing presidential religious proclamations. The episode challenges the often repeated claim that Jefferson steadfastly refused to issue religious proclamations despite the substantial political cost of such a stance, thereby emphasizing that his position was principled. Clearly, political benefits as well as costs accompanied action on either side of this controversial practice. In the Danbury letter, Jefferson concluded that the First Amendment prohibited the President of the United States from issuing religious proclamations, yet as President he employed rhetoric and official utterances that, in terms of religious content was virtually indistinguishable from the traditional Thanksgiving Day proclamations issued by his presidential predecessors and by state chief executives. Jefferson used language skillfully to play both sides of this fractious controversy. He satisfied the disestablishmentarians by declining to issue official religious proclamations, yet he used religious rhetoric in public pronouncements that appealed to pious constituents who thought social tranquility required leaders to cultivate religious morality and to acknowledge God publicly in the life of the nation. In his first inaugural address, for example, after gratefully acknowledging, this is quote, an overruling providence, Jefferson wrote and says, "And may that infinite power which rules the destinies of the universe lead our counsels to what is best and give them a favorable issue for your peace and prosperity." End quote. His first annual message to Congress brims with thanksgiving. It says, "While we devoutly return thanks to the beneficent being who has been pleased to breathe into them the spirit of conciliation and forgiveness, we are bound with peculiar gratitude to be thankful to him that our own peace has been preserved through so perilous a season, and ourselves permitted quietly to cultivate the earth and to practice and improve those arts which tend to increase our comforts." His second annual message, opened with the following thanksgiving, says, "Well, when we assemble together, fellow citizens, to consider the state of our beloved country, our just attentions are first drawn to those pleasing circumstances which mark the goodness of the being from whose favor they flow, and the large measure of thankfulness we owe for his bounty." Jefferson concluded his second inaugural address by asking Americans to join with him in prayer that the quote, being in whose hands we are will so enlighten the minds of your servants and guide their counsels and prosper their measures, that whatsoever they do shall result in your good and shall secure to you the peace, friendship, and approbation of all nations. End quote. His public papers are replete with similar expressions of thanksgiving and devotion. More important to the present discussion, Jefferson had a hand in crafting proclamations for religious observances when he was an elected official in his native Commonwealth. A careful scrutiny of Jefferson's public record on this issue buttresses a jurisdictional interpretation of the wall erected in the Danbury Letter. In marked contrast to the separationist message of Danbury Letter, Jefferson demonstrated a willingness to issue religious proclamations in colonial and state government settings. For example, as a member of the Home of Burgesses, on May 24, 1774, he participated in drafting and enacting a resolution designing a, quote, day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, end quote. Jefferson recounted in his autobiography, says, "We were under conviction of the necessity of arousing our people from the lethargy into which they had fallen, as the passing events, the Boston Port Bill, and thought that the appointment of a day of general fasting and prayer would be most likely to call up and alarm their attention. We cooked up a resolution for appointing the first day of June, on which the Port Bill was to commence, for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, to implore heaven to avert from us the evils of civil war, to inspire us with firmness in support of our rights, and to turn the hearts of the King and Parliament to moderation and justice." Jefferson seemed pleased with this accommodation between religion and the civil state in May 1774. In 1779, when Jefferson was governor of Virginia, he issued a proclamation appointing a, quote, a day of public and solemn thanksgiving and prayer to Almighty God, end quote. This proclamation was issued after Jefferson had penned his famous bill for establishing religious freedom. Also in the late 1770s, as chair of the Virginia Committee of Revisers, he was chief architect of a revised code that included a measure entitled, quote, a bill for appointing day of public fasting and thanksgiving, end quote. This legislation apparently was framed by Jefferson and introduced in the Virginia legislature by James Madison on October 31st, 1785. The bill authorized, quote, the governor or chief magistrate of the Commonwealth, with the advice of the council, end quote, to designate days for thanksgiving and fasting and to notify the public by proclamation. Far from simply granting the governor power to appoint days of public fasting and humiliation or thanksgiving, the bill included the following punitive provision, and it says, Every minister of the gospel shall on each day so be appointed, attend and perform divine service and preach a sermon or discourse suited to the occasion in his church, on pain of forfeiting £50 for every failure, not having a reasonable excuse. Although the measure was never enacted, it was sponsored by Madison, and a surviving manuscript copy of the bill bears a notation in the clerk's hand, it says quote-unquote clerk's hand, that indicates that it was enclosed by Jefferson. The final disposition of this legislation is unimportant to the present discussion. The relevant consideration here is that Jefferson and Madison jointly sponsored a bill that authorized Virginia's chief executive to designate days in the public calendar for fasting and Thanksgiving. I just want to conclude with this part of the chapter. Thomas Jefferson still survives. Jefferson's law and its appropriation by the modern judiciary have been sources of bitter controversy since the metaphor was rediscovered and supposedly, or his quotations rediscovered in 1947. A civil conversation about the figurative phrase promises to enrich popular understandings as well as a judicial and political interpretations of the prudential and constitutional role of religion in public life. Therefore, there is much to be gained by revisiting the origins, interpretations, and applications of the metaphor. So significantly, the Supreme Court, by its extensive and continuing reliance on the law, and indeed by its elevation of the metaphor to a virtual rule of constitutional law, invites the study insofar as the court appropriated Jefferson's metaphor and then misconstrued that metaphor in its application, and insofar as the law misconceptualizes the First Amendment principles as critics allege. The court's jurisprudence may lack analytical merit and legitimacy. This book focuses primarily on the history of the metaphor. Much of the modern controversy that surrounds Jefferson's law, by contrast, is less about the historical record than about the legal, political, and ideological uses of the metaphor in these times. Current debate centers more on defending or opposing the wall Justice Hugo L. Black built in Everson than on understanding the metaphor Jefferson used in a Danbury letter. Sadly neglected in the discussion is the historical construction of the wall. The attention and influence appropriately accorded to the metaphor in constitutional interpretation and political discourse merit consideration, given judicial reliance on this figurative phrase. Simply put, what is the relevance of Jefferson's early 19th century trope in interpreting the Constitution and shaping public policy for the 21st century? This question must be asked of those who endorse the metaphor's use in contemporary law and politics. Would American church-state law policy and debate be significantly different today had the wall not been introduced into public discourse? The contours of the church-state debate might have been similar absent the wall, because separationist principles had been articulated in Western intellectual thought before Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptists, and an influential separationist perspective almost certainly would have emerged in judicial, political, and popular discourse. Absent Jefferson's metaphor, however, the debate might well have been a more candid and transparent, insofar as first, separationism would have been clearly understood as only one among several plausible constructions of the First Amendment, and second, separationist partisans would have been compelled to articulate precisely the presuppositions and assumptions of their perspective, rather than gloss over them with the wall of separation slogan. The danger, say critics, is that once established in church-state jurisprudence and discourse, the wall of separation ceased to provoke critical analysis and reevaluation. Justice Felix Frankfurter similarly warned that the repetitious, uncritical use of felicitous phrases bedevils the law. Says, quote, "A phrase begins life as a literary expression. This felicity leads to its lazy repetition, and repetition soon establishes it as a legal formula, undiscriminatingly used to express different and sometimes contradictory ideas," end quote. When Justice Black uttered his famous pronouncements in 1947 that the First Amendment, says, quote, "in the words of Jefferson, erected a wall of separation between church and state that must be kept high and impregnable," end quote, he forever changed discourse on church and state in America. The wall metaphor entered the vocabulary of law and politics. In the course of time, it came to represent the prudential and constitutional relationship between religion and civil government, supplanting in some respects the actual text of the First Amendment. Since its introduction to public discourse, the wall has been a source of querulous debate. Scholars and advocates warmly debate whether the wall informs or distorts constitutional doctrines regarding the non-establishment and the free exercise of religion, and whether Jefferson's metaphor survives in substance or is rhetoric only. Some argue that the wall has been dismantled in whole or in part. Others contend that the wall made famous by the man from Monticello was redesigned by Justice Black and his judicial brethren. There is no doubt that the wall remains influential in church-state rhetoric. Lost in the controversy is the historical context in which Jefferson erected his wall. Unfortunately, the historical facts are often relegated to the mere props in political and legal struggles to legitimize or delegitimize the metaphor in modern church-state policy and in jurisprudence. Through it all, the wall of separation remains one of Jefferson's most vivid and enduring contributions to the American political and jurisprudential lexicon. Given the extensive and continuing influence of Jefferson's felicitous phrase in church-state law, policy, and discourse, it can be said in the words of John Adams' memorable deathbed declaration that Thomas Jefferson still survives.